Hello, everyone, and welcome. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We have just a few more people joining, so we'll wait just one more minute and then we'll get started. All right, well, it is 1 o'clock in Madison, Wisconsin, so welcome everyone. We will get started today. It is wonderful to see you all here. I am enjoying seeing where everyone is joining us from, so you can absolutely continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. That is wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us for the second of our professional development series this fall. We are very glad that you are here with us, and hopefully you had an opportunity to participate in last week's McKinney-Vento 101 webinar. If you are not familiar with Schoolhouse, this is our team, although it has changed a little bit and grown since this picture was taken. Schoolhouse is a national nonprofit that works to overcome homelessness through education, and we do that through advocacy and practical assistance, such as this webinar today. So we're really happy to have you with us. As we get started, I just kind of want to talk through where we're headed today with our webinar. So we are going to take the time today to really talk about understanding identification and really kind of parsing that out and getting into all of those details about identification and really digging into the deeper parts of identification and eligibility so that you have a really good understanding of what that actually means. And then we're going to take an opportunity to learn from each other and learn from our colleagues. So we will do some breakout rooms later today, and we'll talk through that when we get there. But just so you know, that's coming. You'll have an opportunity to connect with others. All right, so as we get started, we always like to just share some of the recent data that we have so that you can really get a picture of what homelessness looks like and kind of the larger scale. So this is 2020-21 data. And as you can see, the large majority of our students that are identified as experiencing homelessness are in this doubled up category. And doubled up, of course, we are going to talk more in detail about as we continue on in our webinar. But just nationally, that is true, whether we think about on a local level or on a national level, that it typically is around 75% of students who are identified as experiencing homelessness are in these doubled up situations. You can see also that hotels and motels is about 8% and shelters is about 11%, and then unsheltered is 4%. So just to kind of give you a picture of where we're headed. And we do like to also make sure that we share this data on race and ethnicity of students who are experiencing homelessness. Again, this is from the 2020-21 school year. And you can see that our students of color are disproportionately identified. And so some of these strategies that we talk about, we really want to dig into thinking through how we're identifying these students and how we're really making sure that we're doing that in a way that's culturally and linguistically responsive to meet the needs of our students. All right, we also like to share this youth risk behavior survey data. This is from the YRBS survey. And when this question is asked in the survey, it's asked about living situation within the last 30 days. So it's likely higher
Okay, it's me.
number
Can
of
you come over
students.
here? I cannot get sound on my.
It's likely that the number of students is actually higher for those that are experiencing homelessness. But when you think about the students in your classes and thinking about for every 18 and a half students, roughly one has experienced homelessness, this is really a significant number and really significant to think about in terms of identification. So I'm kind of keep this in mind as we talk today and as we go through the information that we have. All right, and then this slide talks about and shows the disproportionate incidence of homelessness for our students. So compared to our white students who are experiencing homelessness, we know that our students of color, our LGBTQ students, our pregnant and parenting teens, they are identified and experiencing homelessness at a rate higher than our white students, and experiencing homelessness, I should say, but not always identified. And so we really want to make sure as we're thinking about identification, as I said, that we're really thinking about how we can be identifying these groups of students and making sure that as our students are experiencing homelessness, that we're figuring out how to meet their needs and provide the services for them to be successful. All right, so when we think about identification under McKinney-Vento, we want to talk about what is actually required. So the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act is a federal law that requires all homeless children and youth to be identified through school personnel. So what this means is that every LEA is required to have a designated homeless liaison who is responsible to ensure that these things happen. Now, it's possible that in your LEA, you have a designated homeless liaison, but there's somebody else like a social worker or an enrollment office person or a school counselor that's actually doing the identifying, and that's okay. It's okay to have that other person. It's okay to have building points of contact, but we want to make sure that there is somebody that is making sure that our students are identified through outreach and through coordinating with other places. So what does that actually mean, outreach and identification? We want to think about how can we really connect with families to make sure that families and students know what McKinney-Vento is and how to be identified. For many of us, that looks like putting up posters in schools, putting up posters around the community, having brochures, things like that, to really make sure that our children and youth and families know what McKinney-Vento is and what their rights are under the law. So we know that in an LEA, all staff have relationships with students, and students connect with different staff members in different buildings, whether that's a bus driver, a cafeteria worker, a school counselor, a school social worker, a teacher. All school roles are encountering students and building relationships with those students. And so we want to make sure that all of these school roles and people in these roles understand what identification is, have a basic understanding of McKinney-Vento, and know what to do if they're talking to a student or they encounter a student and they're concerned about that student's living situation. So for example, if you're a bus driver, you may notice that a student getting dropped off at a different bus stop than usual has become a pattern, and that may seem really unusual to you, or that they're being dropped off by a car at a bus stop and then being picked up by the bus there. And that may seem a bit concerning. It may become a pattern. They may be missing the bus frequently. As a cafeteria worker, you may notice that students are not eating, that they may have consistently negative lunch balances, and so they're not eating. You may notice as a teacher that students in class are tired or hungry, that they're struggling with hygiene. If you work in an office, you may notice that students are arriving late or that they're chronically absent. And all of these things could be indications that a student is experiencing homelessness or is in a housing insecure setting. And you really want to make sure that you're paying attention to that and you know what to do when you encounter those situations. So whether that's our earliest learners or whether those are our high school students or anyone in between, that they know that you're a safe person to share that with because they know that you know what to do when you see that, when you encounter those situations. And so it's critical that all staff members have a basic understanding of McKinney-Vento, but also that they all know the process to make those referrals to the homeless liaison, that they know who to contact, that they know what that process is, and that can happen easily and quickly when there's a concern about a student. So just very briefly, for those of you that may not have had an opportunity to join our McKinney-Vento 101 webinar last week, we want to just do a quick recap of the definition of homeless under McKinney-Vento. So under McKinney-Vento, the term homeless children and youth means any child or youth who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And so any situation that a homeless liaison encounters, we're thinking through that filter. Is this living situation fixed? Is it regular and is it adequate? And if the answer is no, then we need to identify those children under McKinney-Vento. So what exactly does that mean? When we're thinking about fixed housing, we're thinking about housing that's stationary, that's relatively permanent. It's not changing on a regular basis. A regular housing is predictable, it's consistent, it's relatively permanent. The student or youth has an opportunity to stay there over the longer term. And then adequate housing is really thinking through, is it sufficient for meeting the needs of that student that they would typically have in a home environment? Do they have a place to sleep? Do they have a safe space? Is it actually a place where that student can go and get a good night's rest before they're coming to school? And we're going to talk through a little bit more about what that means. So if you've got questions about that, you can absolutely drop those into the chat, or you can hang on to them, and it's possible that we may get there. All right, so one question that we have consistently is, what does that kind of substandard housing mean? How do we know if a student is in substandard housing? So we really want to think about, does that student have access to those basic services and basic utilities? Is there water in the home? Is there electricity? I live in Wisconsin, so we certainly want to make sure that there's heat in the winter. It gets pretty cold here. Is there mold? Is there, just things that would really affect a student's ability to go to that place and to get a good night's sleep and to be sufficient for that student? So it's possible that this may be, if you think through some of the different living situations that our students are in, sometimes we hear the question of, we have students who live in a trailer park. Is this considered substandard housing? And the answer to that question is always, it depends. It may be a situation where in that trailer, there is not running water or there is not electricity. There may not be heat if it's somewhere that gets cold in the winter, or it's possible that it might be. And those trailer parks may have trailers that are set up to be lived in year round, and they have all of the things that child would need to live in that housing. So it's really, again, looking kind of at those basic services and those basic things that a student would need to have their needs met. Okay, so when we think through identification, we want to really think through eligibility. And how do we know if our students are in a situation in which they're eligible to be identified under McKinney-Vento? So I'm going to give you these, and then we'll go into more detail about each of these different categories. So first and foremost is sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or similar reason. This is typically referred to as doubled up. And when we looked at our data at the beginning a few minutes ago, we talked about roughly 75% of our students identified are in these doubled up situations. So just to give you some context, and we're going to talk about kind of each of those pieces of sharing housing. So we'll have some more specific information in just a minute about that. Students who are living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or campgrounds. Again, this is due to a lack of adequate alternative accommodations. Students who are living in emergency or transitional shelters, living in public or private places that are not actually designed to be lived in. So this might be a car or a park, an abandoned building, something like that. And then an unaccompanied homeless youth who lives in any of these circumstances. And so one thing I do want to say about unaccompanied youth is that we first look at their living situation, and then we look at whether or not they're unaccompanied. And we're going to talk more about what that means in just a minute. All right, when we think through understanding doubled up, we know that it's sharing housing due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or similar reason. So those are situations in which a student would be in a doubled up situation. However, when we think through what might not be a doubled up situation, we really want to think about, was it a mutual decision to live together for mutual benefit? So just some examples of that. I know often we hear, well, this family moved in with this other family, and that's because they can't afford their own housing, but they're living together, and so it benefits all of them because they're in that situation. And I would say that's not necessarily mutual benefit. So a situation in which you would be living together for mutual benefit is sometimes you may have a family that moves in with grandparents because those grandparents are a primary childcare provider before and after school. And that decision is made that they're sharing that housing. Everyone can be there. There's no risk of anyone losing housing. Everyone has an adequate place to sleep. And the reason for that shared housing is for the benefit of having that childcare present in that home. Or another situation, if you have families that make a decision to buy a home together, that happens sometimes in multi-generational families, that would be potentially another situation in which that is that mutual benefit. So it's not one family moving in with another, it's that mutual decision to live together. All right, so when we think about sharing the housing of others, we talked about this just a little bit, but it really implies that the child or youth is staying in someone else's residence. So the child or youth doesn't have any legal right to be in that home. They're not on the lease, they're not on the mortgage, things like that. They could be asked to leave at any time. And then we want to think about where they're sleeping in that home. Again, are they sleeping on the floor? Do they have a bed? Do they have a bedroom? Or are they in the middle of the living room where there's people coming and going all night and they're not able to get a good night's sleep? We really want to know, where would that student be or that family be if they weren't in that residence? And so if the student is in a situation where they say, I had to move in with my grandparents or with an aunt and uncle, we have nowhere else to go. If we weren't living there, we'd be living in our car and I'm sleeping on the floor. That's absolutely a case in which a situation of shared housing would be a McKinney-Vento eligible situation. All right, when we think about due to loss of housing, we really want to think about that implies that there's no personal housing available for that student. So thinking through, was there an eviction? Did the family lose housing due to eviction or foreclosure? Was there a natural disaster that caused the family to use their home? Was there some unsafe condition? Again, thinking through, were they unable to be there because of safety? Was there domestic violence and one parent had to leave with a student due to domestic violence? Was there family conflict? Was there a parent that abandoned a student and the student had to leave? So thinking through that loss of housing is really important when we're thinking through doubled up. And that is one of the questions to think about is, why are these students living with this other person? Was there a loss of housing? And really looking at where they were at before they moved into that doubled up situation. And due to economic hardship, of course, implies that they are unable to have their own housing. So they're unable to pay rent or mortgage or other bills or things like that. So that economic hardship could be due to a number of different things. It could be due to an accident or illness, a loss of employment. It could be due to domestic violence, that the parent had to leave, but maybe that parent didn't work and is unable to get their own place. And I do want to say that there's no time limit on homelessness. So these doubled up situations can go on for years and still be considered doubled up situations, particularly because of the high housing costs that we have right now, the shortage of affordable housing, and also some of the residual effects of the pandemic, where families may have lost jobs and things because of the pandemic and are still working to kind of dig through some of that financial hardship that they may have experienced. All right, one common question that we frequently hear at Schoolhouse is thinking through those multi-generational families. And typically we hear things like, well, these families are living together, but that's a cultural value or it's a cultural norm. And so we don't identify those students. So we do want to say that just because a multi-generational family may be a cultural value, it does not necessarily make it not a homeless situation. So those situations still have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, just like every other situation. So again, we want to think through who's included on the lease. Does everyone have a space to sleep? Are members of the household looking for somewhere else to be? Was there somebody living there already and another family moved in? And so I want to just give a couple examples of when this might be something that's cultural or the cultural value and when it might not. When I was a homeless liaison in a district, I worked very closely with our Latinx students. And I had one student who, his family, when they were in Mexico, his father had two other brothers, and the three brothers got together and decided, we're going to come to the US and our plan is going to be to buy a house, and we're going to buy it in a particular area of the city. And we want to do this together so that our families are living together. We can help each other with childcare. We can support each other through, academics and school and educational systems and work. And it was a very planned arrangement that this family had. So when they moved into the district where I was the liaison, we of course did not identify them because it had been a plan. All of their names were on the mortgage of this house, and it was a planned arrangement that they had to move in together. On the other hand, I worked with a family who came from Mexico They lost their home in a natural disaster, and they moved in with another family. So the family that they lived with had several kids, and they were a family of 4 students, and they moved into a very small place. So the kids were all sleeping on the floor in the living room, and their intention was to find other housing. But of course, they were in a new place, and they didn't know the language, and they didn't know how to go about finding a job. And they lived there for quite a while until they really got used to being in the US and knowing what they needed to do and kind of processing through what next steps they were going to take. And I think if I remember correctly, it was several years that those families lived together, and several years that those students were sleeping on the floor of this home. And so we identified those students, and we continued to identify them for the several years that they were there, knowing that it was a place that they were going to consistently, but they were also not planning to stay there long term. They were not in an adequate situation. So they were sleeping on the floor, and that really was not sufficient for them. So that's a situation in which the family took them in. It was a cultural value for that family to take in their family coming to the US. But even though it was it ended up being a long-term situation, it was definitely a McKinney-Vento situation because they had not intended to do that and to stay for as long as they did. All right, when we think through hotels and motels, students are identified and eligible under McKinney-Vento if they're staying there due to lack of alternative adequate accommodations. We want to think about if it's really adequate to meet those students' needs. So thinking through how many people are actually staying in that hotel room. Does everybody actually have a place to sleep? How long are they there? Do they have access to food, or do they have access to other things that they need? In a situation where a family might be staying in a hotel or motel and it's not a McKinney-Vento situation, we really look at, was that a family choice? So for example, was there a family that had been previously housed that moved to a new place and decided, instead of finding an apartment and temporarily renting, that they were going to move into a hotel and stay until their house was ready for them to move into, or until their apartment was ready to move into? And that would not be a McKinney-Vento situation because they were housed, they have housing, they're just waiting to get into that housing, waiting for it to be finished. And so it's their choice to stay in that hotel temporarily. So we really want to look at situations like that. It might be that the family is looking to get into a certain school district, and so they're trying to find housing in that school district, and they're choosing to stay in that hotel while they're looking for housing, something like that. All right, I mentioned unaccompanied homeless youth before, so I really want to talk a little bit more in depth about what this means. So an unaccompanied homeless youth is a youth who is experiencing homelessness, who again meets that definition of lacking fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, and is also not in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian. We know that youth leave home for many reasons. It could be they become pregnant, it could be due to sexual orientation or gender identity, it could be due to parental substance use or abuse or mental illness. So there's a lot of reasons that a youth can leave home. And frankly, under McKinney-Vento, it doesn't necessarily matter what that reason is. We don't look at, well, could the student go back and stay there because the parent says they're just not following the rules? There was clearly something that led that youth to leave. There was conflict that led that youth to not stay in that home. And so we really want to make sure that we're not thinking, well, the parent says the student can stay, so they're probably not actually homeless. No, there was conflict and the youth had to leave. And so for whatever reason, they left and now they're in a homeless situation. So when we think about the identification of unaccompanied homeless youth, first and foremost, I would say building trust is the most important thing you can do. And we have heard from youth and from our scholars at Schoolhouse that sometimes you have to keep asking and you have to be persistent and you have to continue to say, I want to know if you're okay. I want to talk to you about what's going on. And just really building that trust and showing that you care can be the most important thing when it comes to identifying unaccompanied youth. So unaccompanied homeless youth are eligible for all McKinney-Vento services, and they don't need to have that parent or guardian, whether it's signatures on enrollment forms or signatures on field trip forms, things like that. A youth can be responsible to do that themselves, or the homeless liaison can also be responsible for those things. And an unaccompanied homeless youth can be a youth of any age. So I do want to emphasize that because we are seeing that youth younger and younger are being identified as an unaccompanied homeless youth. When I was a liaison in a school district, I had a little 4K kiddo who was identified as an unaccompanied homeless youth. His mom had unexpectedly become incarcerated, and he was moving in with family and moving around between different family members' houses, often sleeping on their couches before he'd move to the next place. And so it doesn't matter if a child, it's a young child or it's a high school age child, or anywhere in between. It can be a student of any age. All right, so some things to watch out for when we're thinking through identification. We really want to know, now that we know this, now that we have these basics of McKinney-Vento, what do we do with it? Where do we go? How do we know? What should we look for? So these are some kind of signs that may indicate that a student is in a homeless situation, excuse me. So we want to think through, is there enrollment at multiple schools? Has there been a student that's transitioned from school to school to school? Have they been in a different school every year or every couple of months? Is there a lack of school records, gaps in their learning? And really thinking through that attendance piece. Attendance data is a great way to know if there's something that you should be concerned about with a student. When you look at, has the student been chronically absent? Were they chronically absent in the school that they were at before? Is their attendance data show that maybe we need to do some interventions? It might also be, not only do we need to do some interventions, we need to ask about their living situation and make sure that we're removing all of those barriers for them to attend and participate in our school. It may also be that you notice a student has poor hygiene or unmet medical or dental needs. They may come to school wearing the same clothes over and over and over again. They may come to school and sleep in classrooms and fall asleep and not be able to engage in class because of exhaustion. There might be social or behavioral changes. They might be really shy, or they might be really aggressive. They might be really clingy and not want to leave school at the end of the day. There might be challenges with their peer relationships or with other adult relationships in school. It may be that at the end of the day, the particular student is not wanting to leave and they're hanging around in a classroom, or they're hanging around in a cafeteria, or somewhere where they're not wanting to leave that situation to go back to the situation where they're staying. It may be that students are not participating in things like after school activities. They may lack those basic supplies to be able to participate and engage in schools. And so thinking through, is this something I need to be concerned about? Certainly, if a student doesn't have a supply that they need for a class, it doesn't automatically assume they're in a homeless situation, but we really want to look for kind of some of those patterns and some of those things that might be concerning. All right, so if we're concerned about a student, what do we do? Who makes the determination? How do we know? This is really important because, as I said before, McKinney-Vento requires every LEA to designate a homeless liaison. Again, that person is responsible to ensure that this identification happens, even if it's other staff within the schools or within the LEA that's working with students. It's really, really, really important to think through who is in the role of the liaison. I have said this for many, many years, that it needs to be someone who is able to build relationships and trust with students in order to identify them. I worked recently with a school who the principal was the liaison, and families did not feel comfortable talking to the principal. It was like being sent to the principal's office when there was a concern about their housing situation. There was a lot of tension because the principal was also responsible for discipline, for truancy, and their numbers were really low. And they wondered why, and they knew that they had students who were in homeless situations. And when that school decided to change who was that liaison, it became the social worker who had those relationships with families and who was really working to meet those family needs. They saw their identification skyrocket, and they were able to actually serve students and provide them what they needed to be successful, because the social worker had those relationships and knew how to make those connections and wasn't wearing that hat that was also discipline and truancy. So that's really, really key to think about who is in the role of the liaison. And for anyone who's not in the role of the homeless liaison, who's not in that point of contact in a building position, we really want to think through, it's not your job to identify, it's your job to refer. So you don't have to know and understand absolutely everything about McKinney-Vento. You don't have to be an expert in eligibility, but you have to know what to do. And so if there's not a clearly laid out process, that's a really good indication that it's time to think through one, so that if a bus driver or if a cafeteria worker or if a teacher or a custodian or any school staff member has concerns about a student, they have a clear and easy process to make those referrals to the liaison. So it's a great time to talk with your homeless liaison about that if you are not the person in that role. And again, it's the liaison or the point of contact that's really doing that determination of whether or not they're eligible. One way that you may be able to help, if you're in an enrollment office, for example, you can make sure to include a housing questionnaire in that enrollment paperwork. You can ask about where they're living. You can be familiar with the addresses of places in your LEA. That might be a shelter, that might be a motel that families frequent. And then we do have some resources in here regarding eligibility and kind of gathering that information. So you should have access to the slides, so those links will take you to those resources. All right, so some strategies for identification. Again, I will say over and over and over, relationships are the key to all of this. But when we think through how to identify students, we really want to think about what is it that's going to help that student or that family to feel comfortable sharing their situation with us. So first and foremost, we want to avoid using the word homeless. We don't want to use it with our school staff. We don't want to use it with families. We don't want to use it with youth and just say, are you homeless? Are you in, we want to think through, are you in a student that might be in a homeless situation? Are you a student in transition? And really think about that first language. Are you a student experiencing homelessness? You're first and foremost a student, and you might be in this situation, but you're first and foremost our student. So think through different ways that you can come up with language that you can use consistently across your district on how to talk with students. And even better, forget saying anything about being in a homeless situation and just say, we have some concerns and we want to talk with you and tell you how we might be able to help you or supports that we might be able to provide for you. So the more open and the more you can be careful about the language that you use and be really intentional about that, the more families are going to trust you and they're going to be open to sharing their situation with you. Again, thinking through enrollment forms or housing questionnaires to inquire about living situations, whether that's at the time of enrollment or whether that's a form that everybody completes at various times during the year, that's going to be really key. So you might have all families complete that at the time of enrollment, and then you might do it again second semester when families are coming back maybe from winter break and their housing situations might have changed. You might send that to everybody, to all families, so that families have an opportunity to self-identify and have a process for any other time during the school year. As I mentioned, if you don't have one in place, it's a great time to think through that and to have those conversations in your district of what staff can do. So being mindful that housing is fluid, again, thinking through someone's housing situation can change at any time during the year. How are we making sure that at any time during the year, a child or youth or a family knows what to do and who to contact? So some of those outreach things that we mentioned, I believe earlier, thinking through, we have posters hanging in our schools. Are there brochures in our enrollment office? Are there places in the community where we can be putting this information where families are frequenting? I will tell you that as a state coordinator, I often heard, well, we live in a really small community. We don't have anywhere to hang notice or hang posters or put brochures. We're just a small community and there's no way for us to do that. And I would say, get creative about it. Do you have a post office in your community? Do you have a gas station in your community? I once worked with an LEA that the only place that they could think of was the ice cream shop in their community where everybody went all summer long. And so they decided to partner with that business and to hang their posters and information. And then they also set up tables there a couple of times right before the start of school to catch some of those families that was just kind of the local hangout. So, so really be creative and think through how you can let families know how to reach out to you, how to contact you, and to make sure that they're identified so that students have the support that they need. I also mentioned before absentee information. So look at that data. Look at data on absences and tardies. Follow up with those students and be sure to ask questions. If you're in the role of doing that identification, it's okay to ask those questions. Is there something preventing you from getting to school in the morning? Are there barriers that we can help you with? Is there something going on that's causing you to miss school? We really want to help and support you with that. So again, coming at that identification through a lens of, we care about you, we want to help you, and that's why we're asking you these questions. It's also really important to make sure that all staff have a basic understanding of McKinney-Vento. So for those of you that are in other staff roles that are joining us today, that's kind of why we talked very briefly through some of those pieces of the law to give you that really high level picture of what McKinney-Vento is, so that you know, okay, this is what I need to listen for. These are the words someone might use to indicate that I need to make that referral to the homeless liaison. Again, those outreach materials are very crucial. Hanging them where people can see them, and hanging them or putting them out in a language that families in your community can understand. So if you have a large population of students in your community who speak Hmong, making sure that that is available, whether that's in written form, whether that's in a video form, however that is, to make sure that it's in the native language of those families in that community, so they also know how to access services. Know the process to refer to the liaison. And then also asking about younger siblings in the home. If you're in enrollment or if you're in an office, that's a great opportunity to say, yeah, we really want to help your family. We're gonna work with the homeless liaison on this. We also want to know, do you have non-school age kids that are with you? It might be a great opportunity to connect some of our early learners to those early learning programs or early interventions as well. So asking about everybody who might be in the home. I will say social media and school websites are becoming increasingly common as ways to reach out to families and let them know about McKinney-Vento and helping to identify. I know there are several places around the country that are doing some social media campaigns. I do also know that there is a place that is doing a billboard campaign, and they've contracted with their ARP-HCY fund, so I'll put in a plug for that, to do some advertising on billboards in their community at the beginning of the school year, and then also when school comes back after winter break, so that families know, oh, if I'm in this situation, here's who I can contact at school. Here's what this program is. Here's how I know what to do with this information. And they are using that as a way to try to identify all of their students and make sure that students and families are aware of McKinney-Vento and what resources are available. So be creative of thinking through how you're reaching out to families to help with that identification. I did also hear from a community that had a QR code that they had hanging around their community, and families who were non-English speaking. They had a large population of Spanish speaking families, but had some concerns about their literacy as they were trying to read some of the flyers and information that was in Spanish. And so instead of making it, well, you have to read this to figure it out, they created a QR code, they hung it around the community, and families could scan that QR code and hear verbally the information about their McKinney-Vento program. And know who to contact in the school. So again, think creatively, think outside the box to do some of that outreach for identifying families. All right, so when we think about best practices, so how do we make sure that our families know about McKinney-Vento, that they know about identification, that we're doing the very best we can to identify the families that are in homeless situations? We really want to create that welcoming environment for all students and families. Again, thinking through, is there somebody bilingual who's in our front office to welcome these families? Do we have a space for them where they can have private conversations with the homeless liaison or a building point of contact? Are we using that housing questionnaire for families to self-identify? And is that housing questionnaire done in a way that's really sensitive? Instead of just saying, are you homeless? Yes or no. You can ask questions in a way that's really going to help a family to feel more comfortable in asking. I think also when you're asking some of those housing questions, one of the things that as a homeless liaison, I always said is, I'm not trying to get into your business. It's your business. You don't need to share any more with me than you feel comfortable. But what I really want to do is figure out how I can best support your student and best support your family. And so you can share as much or as little as you want, but just know that the only reason I'm asking you these questions is to try to help. And families were not always, but they were often receptive to that when they knew that I was coming from a place of really wanting to support their student and really wanting what was best for their student. And then partnering with the homeless liaison. So I have said this over and over and over again, but that relationship with the homeless liaison is critical. Know who that person is know what the process is, know how you can work together. Can you be responsible to monitor attendance together? Can you be looking at attendance together? Can you invite that homeless liaison into an attendance meeting or into a regular staff meeting to make sure that everybody's on the same page and looking at that same information together? All right, I want to play you this very short video. This is from two people that I have had the wonderful pleasure of working with in my time as the state coordinator. And they are specifically addressing identification during the enrollment process. But the things that they talk about in this video are strategies that can really be taken across many different roles within a district. So just because they're in identification, they're going to talk through welcoming students. They're going to talk about providing other ways to connect with families, things like that. And so I hope that the strategies they share, that you can think about ways in which you can also utilize those in your role.
Hi, I'm Audra Connell, Centralized Enrollment Secretary with the Eau Claire Area School District. And with me is Danny Graham, Homeless Program Coordinator. So we're here today to talk to you about the role that enrollment staff play in identifying and supporting homeless youth. The most important thing I can tell you today is that no matter how your district enrolls, it's just important to come from a place of warmth and kindness for families. You should be treating the families you're working with like a friend coming to you for advice.
Family won't always identify themselves as homeless. Often they might even try to conceal that information depending on what your district may have for enrollment expectations. The enrollment staff are trained annually to recognize signs of homelessness and how to refer them to homeless services. Displaying information for self-identification in and around the enrollment office can be very helpful, including posters and brochures. And it provides another way for us to possibly learn of a family or a student's homeless situation. Having packed backpacks or school supplies on hand in the enrollment area also allows for quick access if a student needs those, and then they can start their first day of school with those items. And also to have some community resources and district resource information on hand so that a family can walk away and access those also to help them if they have any other needs.
So as the enrollment secretary, my job is to find the clues that can indicate that a family is facing hardship. It's really important to remember that this process should never create a barrier for a family. If a family is unable to provide the necessary paperwork, ensuring that I can take them through that line of questioning that helps identify them as being in a homeless situation, knowing their rights to not have to provide that documentation to enroll immediately. You want to limit your requirements really to the minimum. You want to be familiar with all the situations in your area, be familiar with addresses of local shelters, hotels, motels, campgrounds, and just be available to assist them in the way that most benefits that family. So you want to be flexible at all times and ask them what works. If they're unable to physically come into your office, offer other options such as virtual or phone enrollments. Be sure to provide follow-up materials. So if there's something that comes to mind later, they have the ability to research, reflect, and follow up with the appropriate staff.
So it's very important to create a standard practice to ensure that students are not missed or overlooked, especially if there are multiple enrollment sites, including those things like sending some kind of communication to the homeless contact in the buildings and the district, to make sure that if you, as an enrollment person, do see signs of homelessness, that you are alerting them to those so that they can follow up with the family or the student. If you can outline a process for enrollment offices to make sure that a student is welcomed with kindness and families are welcomed with kindness and attentiveness, and that they will not face those barriers to enrollment. And hopefully, they start off their school experience with your district the best that they can possibly do. If you can do those things, then it will really create an opportunity to serve those families and those students that are in those homeless situations as soon as possible. And hopefully that student's education will not be at jeopardy at all. We thank you very much and good luck with all your McKinney-Vento services, and keep doing the wonderful things you do in your district.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, what I really like about what they share is I think those strategies really can be used in a number of different situations. Again, thinking through, are you creating a welcoming environment where families are going to feel comfortable talking with you, whether that's your office, whether that's an enrollment space, whether that's a space in the community that you use to connect with families. It's really important to be thinking through how does that affect identification. If families feel comfortable talking to you and they feel welcome in your space, they're probably going to be willing to share their information with you a little bit more than if they don't. Again, thinking through what are those barriers? How can we make this as easy for families as possible to access school support, to access school resources? If they can't make it to school for a meeting, if they can't make it to school to complete a form or something like that, is there a way that we can go to them? Is there a way that we can really remove that barrier to make things easier for families? So I hope that the information that Danny and Audra shared, you can think through ways to take those strategies and use them regardless of what role you're in.
Hi, I'm Audra Connell, Central.
Sorry. All right. There we go. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so I want to take the information that we've learned so far and I want to put it into a situation, and would love, I see the chat is going crazy and you have lots of great questions. So thank you very much for those. Please feel free to type your thoughts about this in the chat as well. So here is a scenario regarding Rosa. So Rosa has ridden the bus from the same bus stop for the last 2 years. The bus driver recognizes Rosa and her family. They meet her before and after school. So it's just a really familiar situation. The bus driver knows who she is. He greets her in the morning, things like that. One day, the bus driver notices that she hasn't ridden the bus for a few days. And he may ask other students what's going on and if anyone's seen her, and no one seems to know. But after several weeks, the driver notices that she's arriving to the bus stop in a car and she's being dropped off at that bus stop. So the bus driver is concerned. The front office staff at her school has also been tracking Rosa's attendance for a week or so, noticing that she's missing a few days. They've reached out to Rosa's family, both by phone and email, but there's been no response via email and the phone number has been disconnected. So her attendance reaches the point where they're beginning to think about, do they need to send a truancy letter? Do they need to do some interventions on her attendance? So they send a letter home, but the letter is returned several days later and is not deliverable. When Rosa finally returns to school, she's sad and withdrawn. She sits in class with her head down at her desk, and her teacher notices she's not bringing her backpack to school. She's missing supplies. She's not completing her homework. During lunch, she hides in the bathroom. When other students have left the cafeteria worker notices that she takes an apple out of the trash can. All of these school staff members report their concerns to the principal, who tries to talk to Rosa. She refuses to share information. So the principal later finds her in the hallway and she's visibly upset. So this is a situation. This is a true situation. So we want to think through, what is each staff member noticing about Rosa's situation? What should they be noticing? What are those key changes that they should pay attention to? What is Rosa experiencing that may indicate she's experiencing homelessness? And then finally, what should school staff do with this information? So again, we've talked about this. Hopefully you know the answer to that question by now. And then why is it likely that she's now experiencing homelessness? So if you want to just type some information in the chat, you can certainly do that. And I will give you just a minute and then we'll kind of wrap up this situation before we go on to our breakout rooms. Yeah, absences, mail return, she's sad. She is missing assignments, changes in behavior and appearance, food insecurity, lack of supplies, absolutely. Phone is disconnected. These are great. So at all points of this process, the school staff that Rosa was interacting with had the opportunity to make a referral to the homeless liaison. Now, I will say in this true situation, at no point did any of these staff members make a referral to the homeless liaison. They all made a referral to the principal. And the principal had had some previous contact with the student, with Rosa, for behavioral concerns. And so when the principal tried to reach out to her, she was very hesitant and very unwilling to talk with the principal. This is why it's critical to know that process to refer to the homeless liaison, to know who those people are that have a relationship with Rosa and can talk with her and can help connect to the homeless liaison. So sometimes we may find, like in this situation, the teacher went with Rosa to meet with the homeless liaison to talk through what had happened. And it was only at that point, because Rosa has a relationship with her teacher, that she was willing to share any information. So it's really important that instead of making that referral to the principal and letting the principal handle this situation, that all of these staff members, the bus driver, the front office staff, the cafeteria worker, the teacher, they know who to reach out to. They know what services Rosa might need. And so they can say to the homeless liaison, hey, I'm really concerned about Rosa. Here's what's going on. Here's what I've experienced. And let the homeless liaison make sure that they're identifying the student. This is a true story. Rosa was identified. She was in a homeless situation. Her family had been evicted and had moved in with some other folks in a neighboring district. So once the pieces were fit together in this situation and the homeless liaison was involved, they were able to identify Rosa and begin to provide her some services. It could have happened much quicker had the initial concerns gone right to the homeless liaison. So I think that's, if you've heard nothing else from me today, I think that's the most important thing, is when you are concerned, make sure you are making that referral. All right, well, thanks for talking through that situation in the chat. You all have great information to share. As promised, when we set this webinar up, we really want to give you the opportunity to connect with each other. This is a really wonderful opportunity to talk with colleagues who you may get to talk to often and you may not have ever met. So we're going to create some breakout rooms. And we did that based on the registration for today. So you can scroll through when we get to that, scroll through the breakout room and self-select yourself into the room, whether that's the region that you live in, whether that's the state or the charter school or whatever makes the best sense to you. If you go into a breakout room and you're alone in that room, please just join another room. It doesn't make any difference. There's no reason you can't join with another state team or with another group, with a charter school group. So please make sure that you do that. So we will create these breakout rooms, and hopefully you all have access to the slides. So in our breakout rooms, we are going to focus on slides 31, 32, 33, and 34. So these are, I will show you quick. These are some question and discussion opportunities. And so if you get together in your room and you think, I've got this situation and this question that I want to put out to the group, and I don't really want to talk about these prompts from Karen, that is totally fine. You use this time that best meets your needs. But if you'd like to, here are some questions and discussion prompts that you can use, indicators that might indicate a student is experiencing homelessness, things to look for. So feel free to use those slides as prompts for your group. But again, if you have something else, a scenario or something else that you need to talk through, that is absolutely fine as well. So if you're not familiar with breakout rooms, let me go back to our slide here. This is how you'll self-select. So you'll click on these dots that say breakout rooms, and you can scroll through the list and click join to the one that you want to leave, that you want to join together. You can move rooms once you're in one. So again, please don't sit in a room by yourself and feel like it's a wasted opportunity. Join with whoever else you'd like to. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes in these rooms and give you some time to talk with each other. Feel free to introduce yourselves to each other and just make some connections before you either jump into the discussion prompts or talk through the scenarios and questions that you have. When we're done with our time together, we'll come back into the large group and take a little bit of time to just kind of talk and wrap up. So we will, Erin is our breakout room guru here. So she's going to pop that up on the screen for you. So again, you'll scroll through here, you'll find the room that best fits your needs and click join on that. And then we'll bring you all back in here in about 20 minutes. And if you need help joining, you can also type in the chat and we can help you manually do that. So let us know if we can help. If you're still trying to join a breakout room, you can feel free to type in the chat which room you'd like to join, and we can move you to that room if you're having problems getting into those.
meeting is being recorded.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking a few moments to join with your colleagues and to hopefully have some good discussion. It sounded like there was some great discussion happening in the breakout rooms. I do want to just take a few minutes as a group to just do some share out of what we learned from our colleagues and one thing that we can do differently after today. So I think the most important thing we can do in a webinar like this is to take the information that we've learned and figure out what our next step is. What are we going to do as a result of our learning today? So we are going to take some time and do some questions and answers too. So if you've got questions, don't worry, we haven't forgotten about those. But just take a few quick minutes and type in the chat and I will read those out as they come in. What was maybe something you learned today from your colleagues in your breakout rooms? And then what's one thing you can do differently after today's webinar when it comes to identification of our families? I'll give you just a second to type in the chat. Check out more resources to help students who have nowhere to go. That's a great idea. There are lots of resources out there in the world, whether those are resources in your community or from Schoolhouse. So we hope that you'll check out our website for some of those resources too. So thanks for that. Amy, thank you so much for that comment. Never assume and train the staff on the front lines. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yep. We hope that you will keep in mind that all staff must be trained on McKinney-Vento and have kind of that basic knowledge to help and support identification. Many of the same barriers as colleagues, housing, transportation, etc. Absolutely. Offering more trainings. And Jamie, thank you for this. We're not alone. Concerns that we have in our small town are those shared by others in larger places too. That's great feedback. Thank you so much. Do a better job getting information out to families. That's great. Reassuring parents that homelessness is not a crime and they should not be afraid. That's again, goes back to that relationship building. Thank you so much. Lack of transportation can be an indicator of homelessness. Great. These are wonderful. Someone just typed in the chat about more help with immigration issues. Thank you so much for that feedback. I will share two resources that we recently have put out at Schoolhouse. One is a resource on supporting our students, our immigrant and migrant students, and one is from a liaison perspective.
Make her screen super big.
So it gives kind of that that frontline perspective of liaisons who work really closely with migrant and immigrant families and some of the strategies, the practical strategies that they've used for that. So I will make sure you have the links to those as well. Since that question did come up, I want to address a couple of things that came up in the chat before. And please continue to ask your questions, and Patricia is monitoring those and doing an amazing job answering those. But questions about refugees, especially families coming from Ukraine, who may be in situations where they're being temporarily housed, for example. There may be churches or other organizations that are temporarily housing them. And just want to say that that may be similar to a transitional housing program. So somebody did comment on that in the chat. And when I was a state coordinator, we kind of worked under the premise of, you know, if they're in a situation where they're in time limited housing, there's case management involved, there's a rental subsidy involved, that really does kind of indicate, that's our indication that it's a transitional program. And we would want to identify those families. So if you have families coming from Ukraine who might be in those situations, that they're temporarily housed somewhere and they're working with an organization or a church, for example, is helping support them, but it's not that stable permanent housing. That is definitely one way to look at it. And we do want to make sure that we're identifying those families as well. Question came in the chat. I will answer these as I can. All right. So enroll a student that's 13 and dad does not want him in school, but he's an unaccompanied youth. Great. So if that student is identified as an unaccompanied youth, they can enroll in school. They don't need a parent permission to do that. They can enroll themselves as an unaccompanied youth. Because the student is 13, you may want to have the liaison in that situation enroll the student, find a caregiver for that student. So somebody who may be a friend or a relative that's kind of willing to take some of those caregiver responsibilities in terms of who might be an emergency contact. So if there's conflict and there's challenges with the parent in that situation, identifying a caregiver that you can also have contact with. Obviously, that's not a legal guardian. It doesn't change legal guardianship, but it just gives someone that you also have as an adult to reach out to. I definitely recommend that, but the student can enroll himself. Thanks
Erin,
for
let me
that.
help you a little bit with the chat
Yes,
box.
please.
That
Thank
is-
you.
That's my job. I'm supposed to be doing that. Could you address the issue of young people who might be living with a grandparent? I always think of that as usually going to be a McKinney-Vento situation, but I can imagine there might be situations where that might not necessarily be McKinney-Vento. So can you walk us through some of the considerations if a youth is with a grandparent?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So in a situation where a youth might be living with a grandparent, it depends. As always, with most of our McKinney-Vento answers, it depends on the situation. So did that student or that youth leave home because there was conflict with the parent? Were they kicked out? Was there something that led that youth to not be able to be at home and they moved in with the grandparent? In that case, absolutely. They lost their housing and they're doubled up because they don't have anywhere else to go. In that situation, we would want to identify that student. Now, sometimes it happens where the parents may have gotten a job out of state and a student is wanting to finish out their senior year, for example, in their school and not wanting to move with that parent. And so the parent makes an arrangement with the grandparent. It's pre-arranged, it's all taken care of, and there's been conversations between parent and grandparent. And they say, you know, my son is going to live with you until the end of the school year, you know, we'll maintain guardianship, but this is going to be an arranged situation. In that case, it would not be a McKinney-Vento situation. Unless that student's housing changes, it's a planned arrangement and agreement with the grandparents. So as usual, it depends, but anytime there's that loss of housing and the youth feels like they can't be at home and they need to leave for any reason, then that definitely is.
That's super helpful, Karen. And I think that you pretty much answered this, but let me just ask it anyway, just to make sure that everybody's clear on that, because we've had a few questions about it. Someone specifically said, if a grandmother has legal guardianship due to a parent being incarcerated, would you consider that student to be McKinney-Vento?
So there's, again, I would say there's layers to this. So if that student has been placed with that grandparent through a court-ordered placement, that student might be eligible under the foster care provisions through ESSA. And so school districts and LEAs have a foster care point of contact. So you'd want to reach out to that person if there's been a court-ordered placement. And so in that case, I would say, again, look at, is the student in fixed, regular, and adequate housing? You know, was the parent suddenly and unexpectedly incarcerated and the student had to move in with the grandparent? Probably not in this situation. If there's been guardianship set up, it's probably been more of a process. So is that a fixed, regular, and adequate setting for that student? Melissa, I like your question in the chat. Where would you be if you were not here? That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's a great one. One other question that has also been asked kind of a couple of different times is about a student who, or maybe two students living together, maybe one student living on their own. They might be 18 and able to sign a lease. And so they've actually rented their own apartment. They've signed a lease, they're paying the rent. Would you consider that student to be an unaccompanied homeless youth? They're clearly unaccompanied, but do you think that they meet also the McKinney-Vento definitions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that one of the most common questions I ever had as a state coordinator was, is there a difference between an unaccompanied youth and an unaccompanied homeless youth? And so yes, absolutely. So if that student is in an apartment that they are paying the rent and they have a lease and it's in their name, we would consider that permanent housing unless something changes in that living situation. So that student is unaccompanied, absolutely, but not unaccompanied and homeless at that time. So unaccompanied but not homeless is not a McKinney-Vento eligible situation. So we really want to look at the unaccompanied homeless youth for that identification under McKinney-Vento.
Thanks, Karen. I think that either you or I have answered really all the questions that came in. The information that you gave on immigrant students was really helpful, and I also posted a couple of links in the chat to that, so take a look at that if you have more questions. So please feel free to type in additional questions if you have them now, but I think we've done a pretty good job of tackling most of them.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Patricia, for being the power behind the chat today. All right, so just as we're starting to wrap up, want to just make sure that you have this information. I'm going to answer this one question in the chat before I do this. Talk about runaway students with police report numbers. So again, we want to look at, did that student have to leave home, and where are they right now? So it doesn't necessarily matter if, we're not looking at runaway status necessarily for McKinney-Vento. We want to know, looking at their living situation. Did they leave home due to conflict? Were they kicked out? Was there something else that happened that's forcing them into a different living situation? Then absolutely that would be a McKinney-Vento situation. So thanks for that great question. You all have had excellent questions. So very quickly before we wrap up, just want to make sure to highlight our scholarship. The deadline is October 15th. So if you have youth and students in your school that you want to pass this along to, we would love to share it as widely as we can. So please make note of that website, and you should be able to get there from the slides as well. So just want to thank you all so much for joining us today. I want to thank Patricia and Aaron for being the brains behind all of this, the chat box and the technology behind it. So we appreciate your time today. We're very grateful for your joining us. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions. We're happy to answer those too. And there are some resources in our PowerPoint as well. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will look forward to connecting with you all again.